All right, everybody, it's compliance increase. I guess I'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming. My name is Tom Boone. I am unemployed, happily. So last August, I did some web crawling to determine what the situation was with regards to third-party HTTP requests in law school library web pages, and also looking at what the tracking implications of those were. So I'm going to be presenting on what I found, but first want to start a little bit with sort of the background of how these sorts of requests work, how cookies work, and how our websites, law school library websites, can be used by third parties to track our users. So this is where I worked until a few weeks ago. And so on this page, everything you see is coming from georgetown.edu, except for one thing down here, this chat with a librarian button. That is coming from Live Meeting, correct?
Yeah, Live Engagement.
Live Persons, Live something. It's a third party who we put a widget there, and they actually handle the technology for our reference librarians to take chat reference questions online. So that right there is an example of a third-party HTTP request being sent from your browser as the person on the website, that just by loading this page, it's not just Georgetown that sees you there. That company that runs the chat also sees you there. So we talk about how HTTP requests and responses work. So this is, at its simplest, what a request for the homepage at google.com would look like. It's just a series of text commands, basically. Tells it the host is going to be at www.google.com. The page that's being requested is index.html. It's a GET request. There are some other types of requests, but for our purposes, we'll just worry about the GET requests. And some other things about encoding language, what to do with the connection. Just means you keep it alive until a response comes back. So your browser, just to load the page itself, sends this request to Google, and Google hopefully sends back a 200 OK response, which has a date, has all this other stuff, has what the content is like. It says, okay, we've responded, now the connection is closed. It will also have that text HTML content as part of the response. That's not what you see on Google, but that's an example of HTML code being sent back to your browser that then is rendered by your browser. So at this point, everything that's being received here is from google.com. Let's say that page has an image in it, and that image is coming from facebook.com. Now we've added a third party to this request, which means that, okay, you've sent the request to Google, Google has sent back this HTML code, and within that code that it sent back, it includes a reference to another domain. So then another HTTP request has to be sent out by your browser to go get that image. Even if that image was hosted on google.com, it would still have to send out a separate HTTP request for every single separate element on the page. So when you're talking about pages that have all sorts of icons and images, you have embedded content, YouTube videos, whatever, you can get hundreds of HTTP requests for a single web page. We think of it as just that single request for that one page, but it's actually sending out potentially hundreds of requests just to load that simple content. But it gets a little more complicated. So here, if Google sends back that response, it can also send, it's not as simple as sending it there, but an HTTP request, I'm going to stumble over those letters every single time I say it. An HTTP request and a response can have what are called headers attached to them. And there are all sorts of different headers. We're only going to talk about a few here today, but those then have privacy implications. So for example, Google sends back its response. It can also send a set cookie header. And so here what they've done is the cookie is called ID. Its value is A3FWA. It's got information about when it expires. And so then that stores that cookie in your browser, on your computer. Then, once that's set there, anytime that your browser sends a request to www.google.com, your browser will send that cookie back to Google. So that way, say you're signed in, Google knows you're signed in. And there could be 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 cookies or more just attached to a single domain. This isn't something where your browser is nefariously working against you. This is the way it's designed to work. That once that cookie is stored on your computer, anytime you send a request, that cookie is going to be served up with the request if it matches with the domain you're requesting. So then looking at, did I go backward? Like I'm going backwards. Oh. Now we can add another header that could potentially be attached to that HTTP response from Facebook or from Google or whomever. So in addition to setting a cookie and saying how long it stays there, and that expiration date could be 10 years from now if they want it to be. Those cookies can stay on your computer for a very, very long time, so they can keep tracking you and knowing every time you visit their page. Then they can also attach a location header to the response. So now all you've done is gone to google.com. Google then requested an image from Facebook. Facebook sets a cookie, and then Facebook can also say, you know what? I think you should also load doubleclick.com/tracker.js. So at this point, you requested one domain, and you've gotten back two others that you don't even necessarily know that were coming in. And that what it can tell your browser to load could be a JavaScript that then watches everything you do on the page. Everything you click, everything you type in and then decide not to post and then delete. It is possible that that JavaScript could be watching everything that you're doing. And you didn't tell anybody to load doubleclick.com. It came in on the back of the other requests that were sent out. So then what happens is your browser sends a request to doubleclick.com and loads that JavaScript onto your browser. This is just the simple way that the web works, because you have to have all these various JavaScripts and all this content from different pieces in order to work. Anytime you embed a YouTube video in a web page, you're putting third-party content there that causes the user's browser to request a third party. So this is a diagram of the online advertising ecosystem as of 2010. So you got to figure it's even more complicated now than it was in 2010. So there are lots of different players, both from the advertiser side as well as the publisher side, which is the publishers are the ones who decide they want to put ads on their sites to get revenue, and of course the advertisers are the ones who provide that advertising content. And on both sides of that equation, you have the advertisers themselves, you have the publishers themselves, but then you have all sorts of analytics companies that provide analytics for advertisers as well as publishers to see what kinds of visitors are visiting the site, what kinds of visitors are seeing the ads, what types of ads are getting the most response, et cetera, et cetera. And they're using these HTTP requests and responses and cookies and all of these things to follow you. So anytime that you go to one site and google.com is there and it serves up an identifying cookie, you go to another site, they also have somewhere in there a request going to that same domain. It will serve up that same cookie, and now Google knows you've been on both of these two sites. So that's why you can go onto Amazon, shop for baseball bats, and then 2 days later you go into Gmail and there's an ad for a baseball bat next to your email. That's because that cookie has been following you around, and while they might not know your name or where you live, they might know where you live geographically but not your address, they will know that a few days ago this person on this computer was looking at baseball bats, and the advertiser that sells baseball bats like, hey, I would like to convert that into a customer, let's remind him that he was looking at baseball bats. This also means that all sorts of weird things can happen, both intentionally and unintentionally. This story from 2013, in that story, there was a researcher, Ashkan Soltani, I believe is his name, and he had a proxy connected to his computer so that he could watch all of the HTTP traffic that was going back and forth as he surfed the internet. He went on to okcupid.com. And if you've never been on OkCupid, the way that they match you up with people is you answer just tons of very personal questions about all sorts of things. And One of those questions, for example, is do you use illegal drugs? So the options are like never, I used to, but I don't anymore, sometimes, or always. And so for purposes of demonstration, he clicked always. And as soon as he clicked the always option, he watched a bit of traffic go off to a data company that showed what he had answered for that question. So now he goes to another site that has absolutely nothing to do with drugs or dating or whatever, and if that same data company is there and that cookie gets served up, they know, hey, this person is an illegal drug user. And those sorts of things are what go into determining what sort of ads that you see. Advertisers probably don't know your name. They don't know who you are specifically, but if that cookie has stayed persistent across your computer as you browse around the entire internet, then it starts to learn things about you, what you're interested in, and then it starts to put you into segments, audience segments. And then what happens for selling the ads is that when you load a page, say you're on Facebook.com, and you load the first page, there are certain spots on that page that have ad content. And while the page is loading, Facebook or whoever the ad company is will send segment information about you to any advertisers that are in the pool to potentially serve you up an ad. And then within a matter of microseconds, there's an auction that happens. And based upon what the advertisers have set as what segments they would like to target and how much they're willing to pay, all of those bids go in at the same time, and the high bidder gets to put the ad for you. So that's why that baseball bat came up in Gmail, was because that was like, okay, the advertiser, just through algorithms only, not someone actually thinking about this, it's like, this guy was looking at baseball bats the other day, I'm willing to pay a lot. We're talking, pennies here, but I'm willing to pay a lot in order to show a baseball bat ad to this person because they're the most likely to be converted into a customer from this ad being shown to them. And this all happens as the page is loading. So we're talking microseconds, milliseconds, whatever the fraction of seconds are. So within law school library sites, when we think about third-party content that we're embedding, we typically are thinking about Facebook, Twitter. Most libraries will use some form of Google Analytics or some other analytics thing. SpringShare, who does all the lib guides and lib everything. Book covers from Synthetic Solutions, and Add This, which has those share buttons that you see on a lot of web pages. So what I wanted to know is what were the consequences of actually embedding all of this third-party content within our sites. And this study was done by a couple of researchers at Princeton, Stephen Engelhardt and Arvind, I'll butcher his last name, Narayanan. And the two of them did a measurement, an automated crawl of the top 1 million websites on the internet to determine how much third-party content was loading in those sites and how much of that was of a tracking variety, how much of that was actually tracking people, both in looking at where the HTTP requests and responses are being sent to and coming back from, and looking at the cookies themselves to determine whether or not they're unique enough to be used as a tracking device. Even if that cookie is not designed to be a tracking device, if it fits certain parameters, it could still be used to track you if they decided they wanted to use it for that purpose. Or if, say, in the case of Radio Shack going bankrupt and selling off all the data they've collected on us, some third party down the road could potentially acquire all this data and then start using that to track people. So in order to do this, I used some software called OpenWPM, and WPM Web Privacy Measurement is what that stands for. And this was created by the two researchers from Princeton, and it basically there's an automated way to crawl websites using something called Selenium, which takes Firefox and you can program it to automatically go to web pages and do certain things on the pages in order to collect data. OpenWPM has all that bundled in, and then it has Python scripts on top of it that allow you to sort of automate that, so you can just give it a list of links. So, first thing I had to do before I started crawling all the library websites is I needed my browser profile to look like a person who had been browsing the web for a very long time. Because when you visit a website and you have no cookies in your browser, if you're using the private mode of a browser, you don't have any cookies or anything else already on there. And so that'll be like the first time that Google or Facebook or whomever has seen you. And so all they'll be doing at that point is just setting a cookie. They won't be reading cookies. They won't be serving up as many ads. But then once they've seen you once, then they can start reading cookies and serving up ads and inviting other third parties to come in and collect information on you as well. So I needed to have a user profile that looked like a real person. So the first thing that I did was I used OpenWPM to use Firefox to crawl the top 10,000 sites on the web. That was a fun week because I did it on my work computer, and that meant that since it took a week, I couldn't shut down my computer for a week. It was a laptop, so I was walking around to meetings holding my laptop open. It did this in a headless manner, so it wasn't opening actual Firefox windows, but every once in a while my computer would start playing music or there would be some news story. It's like, where is this coming from? And it took me about half a week before I figured out that the audio from those pages was actually still playing, even though there was no browser open. So once I did that, I had a nice collection of cookies in my browser. Then I could use that browser profile to crawl all of the ABA accredited law school libraries, their homepages, just their homepages. I didn't go internally, so I wasn't going into the catalogs. I wasn't looking at database lists. For this purpose, I just wanted to look at that homepage to see when you visit that first page, what happens. So, first thing to look at is raw numbers on third-party HTTP requests. What happened with regards to those third parties? So, Boston College came in first. Congratulations, Boston College. This is not meant to be any sort of judgment on anyone. I think for the most part, the more interesting thing was going to come when we start talking about the actual third parties that are involved. So what happened on this crawl is I did 10 simultaneous crawls. So as opposed to just doing it once and assuming that that was a good record of what happens when you go to that page, I had 10 different headless browsers going at once, collecting information, and then I averaged out the numbers from all 10 crawls. So, on average, Boston College Law Library's website makes 195.8 third-party HTTP requests when the home page is loaded. A little bit of trivia. When I was doing some preliminary crawls, this was all last August is when I did this. When I was doing preliminary crawls, there was a school whose library consistently came out with over 400 third-party requests on average. And then when I ran my final crawl, I got 0 third parties on that particular school's homepage because they had no content on their homepage anymore. Anybody know what happened in August of last year that would cause a law library to have no content on their homepage? Charlotte. Charlotte closed while I was doing this process, so they're not part of the final data set. But they were consistently coming out on top for this. Now that said, talking about the average number of actual requests, that doesn't actually mean that much because we don't know from these numbers what kind of requests these are being made here. We need to figure out, okay, that's great that they might be requesting Google Analytics, they might be requesting things from SpringShare, but that doesn't mean those things are tracking you. So, in order to filter out all the noise, so to speak, I used what's EasyList and EasyPrivacy. These are 2 lists that are commonly used by ad blockers. Yes?
How many schools did you say you went to when you checked this out?
200 plus, whatever the current number of accredited schools was at the time. So it was around 204, 205, somewhere in there. So things like AdBlock, other products will use EasyList and EasyPrivacy as the basis for what they block if you have that installed in your browser. EasyList is primarily concerned with advertising, and EasyPrivacy is primarily concerned with tracking. So by using those 2 lists, which are just sort of like regular expression strings, that it looks and compares to the HTTP requests, that I have stored in the database created from the crawls, I can then see, okay, which of these are actually tracking requests? Are requests being made to known URLs for trackers? So this is just an example of what one of those lists looks like. It'd be, we're talking thousands upon thousands of lines of these sorts of things. So, okay, we just want to look just at the tracking requests. The numbers shift a little bit. Numbers go way down, obviously. But now Suffolk is up there at the top with 29.9 requests being made. There is some, but this still isn't really getting to the heart of the matter, because if all 29.9 of those requests are to the same domain, then really that's only one tracker that we're talking about. So, looking at the actual domains, now we're down to Pittsburgh, who is requesting trackers from 13 different domains. But there's still a limitation with that, because all these different domains could be owned by the same company. So you have a company like Alphabet, Google, YouTube, DoubleClick, Facebook owns a lot of things. So anything from Instagram is also part of Facebook. So went through all of these different domains, identified who owned them, and then grouped them together to get an idea of how many different companies were each of these libraries allowing to track. So now we're down to 10 for Pittsburgh and Wyoming. So looking at the averages, you see for just pure third-party requests, the mean 29.5, median 22, but once you start talking about actual third-party trackers, that number drops way down. And when you're talking about the actual individual companies, on average, about 2 companies are showing up with trackers on every single law library homepage. So that's just looking at the HTTP requests. So now we also want to look at the actual domains that are showing up on those pages. So you can see the first 6, and then again number 10, are all the same company. You can see that Google Analytics is showing up on 85.9% of the law school library websites, which isn't that surprising, because that's what most people use to get analytics data about visitors. So if we take this then and combine it into the idea of, okay, so that's all context. Sorry, I didn't specify that. This is not taking into account what's tracking and what's not. This is all third party. So 85.9% Google Analytics of all type requests. If we then limit it just to those tracking domains that showed up in Easy List and Easy Privacy, then Google Analytics stays exactly the same, because they are by definition a tracking company. That's what they do. Now, there's an open question about whether that's a problematic type of tracking. A little bit later on, I'll talk about what's okay with Google Analytics and what's a little problematic with Google Analytics when we start to talk about things you might be able to do to eliminate some problems. But, see, the numbers did go down for a lot of the others. So if we start talking about the individual organizations, the Google company bumps up a little bit higher than what just Google Analytics by itself gets you. But Alphabet shows up on 86.8% in a tracking context of law school library homepages. Once you drop below Google, it drops way down. So Google is everywhere, and then Facebook is in about a third of the places, and then it drops down even farther to, so this is a very long tail. Lots of organizations are tracking, but only a handful are really, in lots of places, and only one is in, over half the places. So that's what we see from looking at the HTTP requests. We can also look at the cookies themselves to determine whether or not they are tracking cookies. As I said before, there's all sorts of cookies being set for different purposes. There's session cookies that disappear as soon as you leave the web page or as soon as you close your browser. There's others that can be set to stay on your computer for 10 years or more. Not all of them are such that they could be tracking you. So for example, with Google Analytics, at its most basic level, Google Analytics will set an ID cookie that identifies the user so that it can track that same user through your entire website as they visit. But as soon as they go to another website that also has Google Analytics, they will get a completely different ID for a cookie, so that it's not connecting the fact that you're the same person who was on the Georgetown website and you're now on the Boston College website. You get a completely different ID cookie there, so it's not tracking you across those two visits. A tracking cookie would be something that first stays the same across the entire crawl of all of the 200 plus schools. So if the value of that cookie stays the same for the entire time that the crawl is happening, then that's one factor of whether it's a tracking cookie. Another factor has to do with the length of it and the uniqueness of it. The Princeton researchers had an algorithm they used to determine the basis for whether or not something was unique enough with the appropriate length. And so I just duplicated exactly what they did so that my results would be comparable to what they did. And from that, I'm able to identify which of these third-party cookies that are being set could be used to track and identify you. When I say identify, I don't mean your name or your personal information, but that it would know that you're the same person who's visiting all these different sites. So, we see that the most third-party ID cookies that are being set, 55 on a single web page load. Of those 55, 20 of them were different domains. Then we can look again at the organizations. And so 17 different organizations were setting identifiable cookies on that one web page, just on that one page load. This wasn't from going across the entire site, a single page, 17 different companies set cookies for that one page on the browser. Looking at the individuals, then you see that DoubleClick is an advertising company, so it seems very strange that an advertising company would be the most common domain that shows up setting third-party tracking cookies on law school library websites. And there's a good reason for why it actually does show up so much that I'll talk about again, and it's connected to Google Analytics. So if we then take all these different domains that are showing up and combine them by company, again, you see that a little over half of the law library websites are having at least one tracking cookie set by Google for users who visit that site. Again, Facebook comes in second, dropping way down about half of what Google does, and then again we get into that sort of long tail situation where there's a lot of other companies that are doing this, but the big ones are just those first two. So there's something else that happens that's called cookie syncing, which is that one domain sets a cookie, and then it tells another domain, hey, this is the ID that I'm using for this cookie, you should use this ID too, and that way they can compare behind the scenes, so they're both tracking you separately, but they can have servers that are then taking this and syncing them together, so that while Google and Facebook would never sync their cookies together because they're big competitors, theoretically, Google and Facebook could set the same cookie ID and then behind the scenes say, what do you have on this person? Here's what I have. And then they have a much fuller picture of everything that you visited, because any sites that Google is not present on and not seeing your cookie in your browser, Facebook might be seeing it. And so then that can get you a more complete picture. So, limiting it just to those tracking ID cookies that we were talking about before, sorry, Harvey. Got 13 instances of ID cookie syncing occurring on the University of Baltimore page. You have add this on your website. Yeah, and I would wager that over half of these in the top 10, if not all of them, have add this on their website, because that's the biggest example of cookie syncing that you'll see, because they don't charge you to put that widget on your page, but then they use that to get other advertising companies to come onto the page with them. Looking at which cookies were synced to the most domains, we're really getting into the minutia of the ad ecosystem at this point, because most of these domains are ones you probably never heard of. I've never heard of most of them, because those are companies that are part of the advertising ecosystem that are collecting data on people, constantly, but then they provide that data to the actual advertisers, the actual publishers, whose names we might actually know. But these are some of the ones that are doing the heavy lifting of collecting information about what you're visiting on the web. And so we see that adserver.org, they had a cookie called TDID, which fit the parameters for being a tracking cookie, and that cookie was sent to 29 other domains. If we look at which domains are sending ID cookies to the most other domains, now AdRoll jumps to the top. There's an explanation for why these numbers would be different, because it could be that this adserver.org TDID cookie could be being sent by means of the referrer header or the location header, or even within actual URL parameters in the request itself. It could be that nexact.com is the one who actually sent the adserver.org TDID cookie to someone else. So that's looking at the individual cookies. This is looking at who actually sent the most cookies. So adroll.com, in the course of this entire crawl, sent cookies to 23 other domains. In terms of who's receiving them, adthis.com was the biggest receiver of ID cookies, more than double what anybody else got. The one surprise that I wasn't expecting here was that Twitter.com is receiving a lot of synced cookies for some reason. Yet they aren't actually sending any synced cookies to anyone. All right, so that's the underlying data of what I found in the process of crawling. So I wanted to talk about two particular instances of tools that there are ways to alleviate the problem. The first is using Google Analytics. On its own, using Google Analytics is not going to be tracking people across the entire internet. As I said, at its simplest, it's going to set a unique identifying cookie for the user as they visit your site, but when they go to another site using Google Analytics, they will get a completely different ID cookie, so it's not connecting those visits as being the same person. However, lots of people like to turn on the demographics and interest reports. Like law school admissions and communications department love this because they can actually see what the demographics are of the people who are visiting their site and who are, prospective students, people that might be interested in applying to those schools. And then we as librarians who have sort of a sub-site that's part of the entire law school, we have that turned on in our site as well, just because the entire law school has that turned on. Well, there's a consequence to turning on the demographics and interest reports, which is, so here's the Google Analytics URL for the request. So this one just happens to be from Albany Law School, but this could be from anywhere that has that demographics tracking turned on. So this request is sent to google-analytics.com. When the response comes back from Google Analytics, because demographics is turned on, they send a location header that says, okay, your browser now needs to load this URL from DoubleClick. DoubleClick is the advertising company that Google runs, and DoubleClick has the same cookie will be tracking you across the entire internet. So the way that Google Analytics knows the demographic information about you is because they bring in their advertising company who's been following you everywhere, and then says, okay, this person is between 25 and 30. They are interested in X, Y, and Z. So that information is coming from DoubleClick. But of course, now that DoubleClick has loaded on this page, their visit to your library website is now part of the corpus of information that they know about you and will play into what sort of ads they get later. So now the people at DoubleClick know, okay, hey, this person is interested in law school, they're interested in legal research, something else has been added to what they know about that user because DoubleClick was brought in by Google Analytics. And of course, that will then set a cookie, or in this case, many, many cookies. Those are all the cookies that were served back to DoubleClick when that browser visited the Albany Law School library webpage. All of those cookies were sent back. And that gets into this whole idea of the ad auction, that all of this information, the reason they're tracking you, the reason they want to collect all this information about you, and the reason why they will do it wherever they can is so that they can sell ads, and so that they can provide information to the advertisers about the person who is visiting the web page, and part of that information is that they visited a law school library website. The other big problem is ad this. And we've probably seen this for 10, 15 years. These little share buttons that show up everywhere on the web. I think they're pretty popular a lot of times on online catalogs for libraries. When you're looking at a record of a certain book or an item, you can then share it with someone that shares the link. The way that Add This makes money is because they have deals with all sorts of data companies and advertising companies, so that when you send a request to load this widget, it sends back location headers telling you, okay, now you need to add, your browser should load all of these tracking and advertising domains as well. You probably already have cookies from those companies on your browser, and so then it serves those cookies back up to those companies. And now their visit to the law school library website is part of what they know about you. And then, of course, with these particular companies, they're going to start syncing those cookies back and forth so they have an even bigger picture of who you are. So this is just an example of showing where on Baltimore website, as I said earlier, they did have Add This showing up as one of the domains that's loading. So that's everything I have prepared, so I've got plenty of time left for questions. Yeah.
One of the surprising websites that I thought that was coming up was New Relic. And my understanding is, that's you put that on your website for performance management issues. Maybe I just don't understand what New Relic is actually doing, but
the problem, so New Relic, part of their ability to see how your site is performing has to do with collecting analytics of people visiting the site. So their privacy policy will probably have things in it that are designed to ensure you they're not going to use the data they're collecting on your users for any sort of tracking purposes, but the reality is that's what they're doing. They're tracking people using these websites.
But it looked like they were sending cookies out. Do you think then what they're doing, for example, is tracking those users across other sites in order to analyze what they're doing on your site? Is that what
I don't know if that's what they're doing or not, but they are setting cookies, and whether or not they're using those cookies for the purposes of tracking people across things, those cookies are unique enough that they could use it to track people. So again, with the Radio Shack scenario, even if New Relic is a good guy, a bad guy might be using it later. Ken?
Well, you answered my earlier question in your talk, because my earlier question was on methodology, so I'll ask this question. Is there an article coming out of this work?
If I can ever stop procrastinating. I meant to write an article right after I collected the data last August, and that still hasn't happened. If I do, I will probably do another crawl so I have more up-to-date data.
Speaking of methodology, so you said that you hit up each of these sites 10 times then averaged the results?
Yes.
What kind of variance are we seeing within those?
I have not analyzed that yet. The only sort of analysis I did across them was to make sure that I actually got a 200 result on all 10 for each.
I mean, just anecdotally, so what are some guesses as to why it would vary?
So it can vary because of, particularly with Add This, what you're going to see come in from Add This, from page load to page load, can be, sometimes nobody else will come in with Add This. I mean, if you, looking at this, what I grabbed, I actually tried to refresh this and visit a lot of other pages, and Add This just never brought anybody else in on that particular page. But other times, I've seen Add This bring in 10 or 20 other domains at one time. So that's why you're going to see a lot of variance. I think you're also going to see a lot of variance because on any given page load, there could be 404s that are inconsistently happening where certain elements of the page don't load, they time out, but then on the next page load, that element loads just fine. and a lot of times those are things you don't even notice because they're just tiny behind-the-scenes scripts that whether they load or not doesn't have any effect on the page. But the big elements are always loading, but you do get variance both in terms of what the third parties bring with them and whether there's success in actually loading all of those things. Other questions? Yeah.
If you look at, so there's a lot of user space stuff for trying to protect your privacy when you're browsing sites. Disconnect, Privacy Badger, ad block. Any effect whatsoever? Did you look at any of that stuff when you did this?
Not in terms, I didn't want to get into sort of like the user education part of this, of having to actually train patrons, because for this, I'm more interested in trying to get the librarians who are running these websites
Knock it off.
to minimize how much tracking they're allowing to occur. But yeah, there are a lot of different products out there. The one that you can see there, I've got it disabled so that everything loads on the page, but that's UMatrix, which is it's open source. And I use that as well as UOrigin. So UOrigin blocks by domain specifically. UMatrix blocks so by default, when you load something, when you load a web page for the first time and you have UMatrix installed on your browser, it will only load first-party content. It won't load any third-party content, which means that most of the time, that page will be broken when you load it. And so you have to go in and manually tell it which domains and subdomains do I want to let in. And I can even, at the top, it's got different categories, so I can tell it, you know what, let's add this in, but don't let cookies from add this in. But you can let CSS or images or media or whatever. This is a very tedious process that I can't imagine that most people would ever want to engage in. Once you figure it out, that page, then it will load correctly from then on. But it is a very tedious process to figure out which particular domains are causing the page to break because it's not loading. So then there's other things like this. Like there was a problem with disconnect. Were they getting money from ad companies?
That was Ghost right? Or maybe they got that reversed.
I don't know. So there's Ghostery, there's Disconnect, there's Privacy Badger from the EFF, and other things, Ad Block Plus, all these different things. And most of them are designed so that you don't really have any control over what's being blocked. They just block things that they block, or you can tell it not to block anything, but you won't have the fine-tuned control to be able to specifically allow or disallow specific domains. Yes.
So is UMatrix what you would recommend using if I wanted to analyze our websites to look for what's being
I would say that UMatrix is good for getting a big picture. If you actually want to see the actual traffic, you would need something like OpenWPM, because what OpenWPM does is as it's running its crawls, it puts all of the HTTP requests, all of the responses, all of the cookies. If you tell it to, all of the Flash cookies. I did actually do a crawl to see if any law library websites had Flash cookies that were being set. And Flash cookies are important because they're not stored with the browser cache. So if you delete all the cookies from your browser, Flash still has a Flash cookie. But Flash is also dying a slow death on the web, and I got 0 hits on Flash cookies when I did that crawl. And I got totally derailed there. Why was I talking about Flash cookies?
checking for
checking
our own websites.
So OpenWPN will actually collect all of that traffic that's going back and forth and store it in an SQLite, SQLite database that you can then use queries to sort of, which is what I did. I had this raw data, and then I ran a lot of SQL queries to both, to compare it to the easy list and easy privacy to see what was in there, and also to determine the number of third parties that were being requested, and all that data came from just running SQL queries on that database. So something like that, or I know that a lot of privacy researchers use man-in-the-middle proxy, which is something that puts a proxy layer between your computer and the internet so that it can capture all of the traffic that's going back and forth. I believe man-in-the-middle proxy is what was used to show the OkCupid instance of the data company collecting information that the user was an illegal drug user.
So it seems like your suggestions are to turn off this demographics tracker from Google Analytics
Mhm.
and to remove add this, do you have any suggestions for replacements, or do you think that we no longer need those per se?
I mean, the problem with the Google Analytics demographics is that most of the time the library doesn't have a say in that. At an unnamed school that you or I might have been affiliated with at some time, there was a conversation with the web communications person to let them know what the consequences of turning that on were, and that person seemed very concerned that that was happening and it was never turned off. So, and I think that the communications type people and the marketing people and the admissions people, they want that demographics information. The problem is that most of what people are doing on law school websites, not all, but most, is what they consider to be, I guess, harmless or whatever. That tracking people isn't that big of a deal because it's all marketing material about a law school. But that changes when you get to the library website because then you have people actually doing legal research that perhaps they don't want to be tracked while they're doing it. Add this, I don't know that anybody even really needs that anymore because I think we all know how to copy and paste a URL from the location bar and post that to Twitter or Facebook. And how many people are actually going to a library catalog and clicking on share and tweeting a book they found in the law school library catalog? I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's happening all the time. But, I don't expect it to be happening a lot.
Did you do any checking if your catalog is not something that would be under the library domain?
Okay, so
Would that be
that
excluded
is
from that?
so an issue with identifying things as third parties. I did do this as sort of a blunt force instrument. I didn't analyze what the third party was versus what the first party. If the domain was different, third party. If it's the same, first party. However, there are situations where a first party domain is already a third party. So any library that has their library homepage hosted on a SpringShare platform, or there were a few that had III as their homepage, and those things might have their .edu domain as the actual domain, but who's actually serving that up would be a third-party vendor. But in that case, really, all of our web hosts are third-party vendors. So no matter,
I actually meant it the other way. Like,
Okay.
if you search for something on our homepage for the catalog, it takes you to worldcat.org. So I'm just assuming that anything like that is
WorldCat.org would be
excluded from your, like you didn't do any tracking testing on worldcat.org.
I mean, I did tracking tests, but presumably they came back with no tracking. Or at least not enough to make the top 10 of any of those lists. I could go back into deeper information, but WorldCat would be considered a third-party domain, and then it would be subjected to the same tests of comparing the string to EasyList and EasyPrivacy, as well as looking at any cookies they set to see if they're capable of tracking someone.
Content delivery networks, do they mess with your metrics on that?
Only in that they turn up as third parties, but most will not show up as a tracking third party. And a lot of times with CDNs, they're purposely cookieless anyway to speed up delivery, so that alleviates one big problem with tracking anyway. And like I said, a good reputable CDN is not going to show up in the EasyList or EasyPrivacy. Any other questions? Thanks a lot.
Thank you.